I can remember going to the barber shop in the morning, and the where they cut hair was up in the front of the barber shop, and then there was a wall that separated that front from a room in the back, was a kitchen. And they had the second floor of the barber shop. They had bedrooms up there. They also had another house in town, which was 2 or 3 blocks from where our house was. But sometimes they stayed at the barber shop, and sometimes they were at their other house. But I would go in there, and Grandpa or Uncle Tom would always fix me what I thought was the best breakfast in the world. Early in the morning after I'd been swimming, I would go in there, and they would give me Marianne gingerbread cookies. Marianne gingerbread cookies were cut and baked in the form of a Dutch girl with a windmill. I mean, that was the cookie. And I'd have 2 or 3 of those, a glass of cold milk, and a cold wiener. Hot dog.
Yeah, Dan, we got it.
Well, with the recent news and everything, I wanted to make that. That, and my mother finally found out that they were doing that, and she read them out, but I still got Marianne gingerbread cookies, milk, and wieners. The barber shop was one of the center focal points for my summer. That was a place I always knew who was there. I always knew what was going on. If I was in trouble, I would go to the barber shop. If I wanted some cold frankfurters, Marianne gingerbread, I would go to the barber shop. So it was one of the focal points as I remember my childhood. And every barber shop, or at least in those days, had a barber pole. It was part of the advertising. The pole with the red and white stripes on it, and it would turn around. Well, they had a pet squirrel. I say it was a pet squirrel. I mean, it was always caged. They didn't train the squirrel to come when you call it or anything. So it wasn't that kind of a pet, but it was. And they had their cage for the squirrel was in the front window of the barber shop. It was kind of like a bay window, and there was a shelf where this cage sat. And they figured out that this squirrel would run on the treadmill, and they figured a way of gearing the axle of that treadmill to a set of gears that ran to the barber pole. And when the squirrel ran on the treadmill, it would turn the barber pole on. Kid you not. One day, my Uncle Tom had been out, and he came back to the barber shop, and Grandpa had kind of a sheepish look on his face, and Uncle Tom said, "What's the matter, Cass?" And my grandfather said, "Buddy is dead." That's the name of the squirrel. Buddy is dead. And Uncle Tom's favorite phrase, it was kind of like a paraphrase, if he wanted to make a point or he wanted to get your attention, he'd say, "Good God Almighty." Cass, "Good God Almighty, Jim." Waldemer, "Good God Almighty." At this point, when my grandfather said, "Buddy is dead," my Uncle Tom said, "Good God Almighty, Cass, what happened?" My grandfather said, "Well, I noticed that Buddy had a bad tooth." Uncle Tom said, How did you know that Buddy had a bad? Well, the way he was chewing the nuts, it just didn't look like he was favoring one side of his mouth when he chewed the nuts. Uncle Tom said, "Well, what has that got to do with Buddy being dead?" Grandpa said, "Well, I figured that he'd be a lot more comfortable if that bad tooth was out of there." So he says, "I got a hold of him and got a pair of rat-tailed pliers." He says, "I was able to get his mouth open, got down in there." He says, "I got that little tooth and I jerked it out." And he says, "But apparently I was holding him too tight." So, Buddy got choked to death.
Good God Almighty!
Did they replace the squirrel, or was that the end of the
I don't think so.
moving barber?
I think that was
So at that time, Dad,
the still barber pole was a monument to Buddy.
you-